On the quiet afternoon of April 9, 2021, Daniel Halseth, a 45-year-old father of three, sat alone in his Las Vegas home. He had once been a proud, loving father who nurtured a deep connection with his youngest daughter, Sierra. But in recent months, that relationship had changed. A growing distance settled between them, replaced by tension that Daniel struggled to understand. Sierra, at just 16 years old, was no longer the carefree child he remembered. Her recent involvement with 18-year-old Aaron Guerrero had only made matters worse. Daniel had grown deeply concerned about the intensity of Sierra's relationship with Aaron. The young couple was inseparable, their attachment to each other obsessive and reckless. To make matters worse, Daniel had overheard a conversation between them, plans of running away together, leaving behind everything and everyone. It sent chills down his spine. He had stepped in as any concerned father would, forbidding Sierra from seeing Aaron, hoping to pull her back to reality. But Sierra and Aaron saw it differently. To them, Daniel had become the enemy. What he believed was an act of protection, they interpreted as a cruel attempt to tear them apart. Anger, frustration, and fear swirled between the two teenagers until their emotions gave birth to something sinister. In the recesses of their young minds, a plan began to form, a way to remove the one person they saw as standing in the way of their love. In the weeks leading up to that fateful day, the tension in Daniel's house grew thicker. Sierra withdrew from her father more and more. Daniel noticed the changes, whispered phone calls, secretive behavior, and the shadow of Aaron's influence hanging over her every move. He tried to reach out, to bridge the gap that had formed, but Sierra's responses were cold, detached. And Aaron, though he didn't live under Daniel's roof, was always there in the background, feeding Sierra's rebellion, encouraging her anger. He had a dark side, one that mirrored Sierra's growing resentment toward her father. As their feelings intensified, they began discussing the unthinkable. They fantasized about a life free from Daniel's control, a future where no one could tell them what to do. But Aaron's words grew darker. He spoke of killing Daniel as though it were the only logical solution. Sierra, caught in a whirlwind of emotions, agreed. They began planning the murder with chilling precision, their conversations no longer filled with daydreams of escape, but with details of how they would end Daniel's life. On the night of April 9th, while the world outside Daniel's house carried on as usual, a storm of violence was about to erupt inside. Sierra and Aaron had made their decision. They believed there was no other way to be free. That evening, Daniel retreated to his bedroom, unaware of the nightmare that was about to unfold. As he drifted off to sleep, Sierra and Aaron prepared for what would be the most horrific night of their lives, and the end of Daniel's. As the clock crept past midnight, Daniel Halseth lay peacefully asleep in his bed, oblivious to the dark intentions stirring in the next room. Sierra, his beloved daughter, was not alone. Aaron Guerrero, her boyfriend, had already slipped into the house undetected, their plan set in motion. The two teenagers, bonded by a toxic mix of love and rebellion, were about to commit an act that would forever change their lives. The idea of murder, once a distant fantasy, had now become a grim reality. In the days leading up to the attack, they had discussed every detail: how they would do it, how they would get away, and how they would start a new life, free from anyone's control. But planning something in whispers and actually carrying it out were two different things. The gravity of what they were about to do weighed on them both, though they kept pushing forward, driven by their shared delusion of freedom. Aaron had brought a knife with him, its blade cold and sharp. He and Sierra stood outside Daniel's bedroom door, exchanging a final silent glance. Sierra's heart pounded in her chest, but her resolve remained intact. This was the only way, she told herself. Daniel, the father who had once been her protector, had become the obstacle. With Aaron by her side, they would be unstoppable. At least, that's what she believed. Aaron slowly pushed the door open, the soft creak of the hinges blending with the steady hum of the house at rest. Daniel lay unaware, his breathing slow and deep. There was no turning back now. Aaron crept forward, knife in hand, while Sierra stood by the door, a witness to what was about to happen. She had convinced herself that this was necessary, that her father's death was the key to her freedom. But even then, a part of her knew she was crossing a line from which there would be no return. Aaron raised the knife, his hand trembling slightly, but once he struck the first blow, something seemed to take over him. The first stab woke Daniel with a jolt, his eyes wide with shock and pain. He tried to scream, but Aaron stabbed again and again, silencing him with brutal efficiency. Daniel fought back with whatever strength he had left, thrashing against his attacker, trying to grab at Aaron's arms, but the teenager was relentless. Blood sprayed across the room, staining the sheets, the walls, the floor. Aaron's face was contorted with rage, each stab fueled by a combination of fear, anger, and adrenaline. It was chaotic and frenzied, nothing like the cold, calculated act they had imagined. The reality of killing someone, especially a man as strong and determined as Daniel, was far more horrific than either of them had anticipated. Sierra, still by the doorway, watched as her father's life ebbed away. In her mind, she had convinced herself that Aaron would do the hard part, that she would remain on the sidelines. But as Daniel struggled to survive, something inside her snapped. She grabbed another knife from the kitchen and joined in, plunging the blade into her father's body. For a moment, there was silence, except for the ragged sound of Aaron's breathing and the dripping of blood. Daniel lay motionless on the bed, his once strong body now a lifeless shell. The room, once a place of safety, was now a scene of unimaginable violence. The brutality of what they had done was overwhelming. They had stabbed Daniel over 70 times, leaving his body mutilated beyond recognition. The plan had always been to kill him, but the reality of it was something neither Sierra nor Aaron was prepared for. Their hands were stained with blood, their clothes soaked through. The enormity of their crime hung in the air like a suffocating weight. But even then, there was no time for reflection. They needed to cover their tracks, and fast. Panic began to set in as they surveyed the bloody aftermath. What should have been a clean, simple killing had turned into a grotesque nightmare. There was too much evidence, too much blood. They had to think quickly. That's when Aaron suggested burning the house down. Desperation fueled their next steps. They doused Daniel's body in gasoline, pouring it over the bed, the floor, and around the room. The smell of fuel mixed with the metallic scent of blood, creating a sickening odor that filled the house. Sierra, her face pale and expressionless, struck the match and threw it onto the bed. The flames caught immediately, spreading rapidly across the room. The fire roared to life, engulfing everything in its path. Aaron and Sierra watched for a moment as the flames consumed Daniel's lifeless body. Then, they ran. They fled the house, hearts pounding, minds racing. They had killed him. They had killed her father. And now, all they could think about was escape. Their plan, once so clear in their minds, was now a tangled mess of fear and uncertainty. But they pressed on, driven by the same twisted desire that had led them to murder. As the fire spread, the neighbors began to notice the smoke rising from the house. Within minutes, firefighters arrived on the scene, battling the flames that threatened to consume everything. It wasn't long before they found Daniel's body amidst the wreckage. The fire hadn't burned hot enough to destroy all the evidence. Instead, it left behind a horrifying scene of violence. When investigators arrived, they quickly realized that this was no accident. The fire had been set deliberately, and Daniel Halseth had been brutally murdered. The search for his killers began immediately, and it wouldn't take long for them to piece together the shocking truth. As the flames engulfed Daniel Halseth's Las Vegas home, Sierra and Aaron fled into the night, filled with a mix of adrenaline and dread. Their plan to run away together, to start a new life far from the control of their parents, was now tainted by the brutal murder they had committed. What once seemed like an act of defiance had quickly spiraled into a nightmarish reality. They didn't have much time. The fire they had set to cover their tracks was already attracting attention. Sirens blared in the distance as firefighters rushed to the scene, and soon the police would arrive too. But Sierra and Aaron were convinced they had thought of everything. In their panic, they had taken Daniel's debit card, withdrawing cash from his accounts to fund their escape. They drove out of Las Vegas, leaving behind a trail of smoke, blood, and broken lives. Their first stop was an ATM, where they withdrew several $100s. Surveillance cameras captured their every move. But in their desperation, they didn't care. All they could think about was getting as far away from Nevada as possible. They filled up the gas tank of the car they had taken from Daniel's driveway and began their journey north, heading for Salt Lake City, Utah. They believed they could disappear, blending into the crowds of a new city, free from the crime they had just committed. Back in Las Vegas, the fire at the Halseth home was quickly extinguished, but the damage was already done. Firefighters, after discovering Daniel's charred remains, immediately contacted the police. The initial signs were clear. This was no accidental fire. The body had been found in a pool of blood, far too mutilated to be the result of the flames alone. Investigators quickly determined that Daniel had been murdered, and their suspicions turned toward his daughter, Sierra, who was nowhere to be found. Within hours, law enforcement pieced together a disturbing narrative. Neighbors reported seeing Sierra with her boyfriend, Aaron Guerrero, in the days leading up to the fire. They had been seen withdrawing money from Daniel's accounts, caught on camera at ATMs. A manhunt began, and an alert was issued across state lines. As Sierra and Aaron sped toward Utah, oblivious to the manhunt that was already underway, they made a critical mistake. They stopped at multiple ATMs along the way, withdrawing money each time, leaving a trail that investigators followed with ease. It was only a matter of time before the net closed in on them. The couple checked into a hotel just outside Salt Lake City, exhausted from their journey. But even then, their behavior was erratic. They recorded a chilling video on Aaron's phone, a twisted confession of sorts.
I don't know what to say.
Welcome back to our YouTube channel. Day 3 after murdering somebody.
Wow! Don't put that on the camera.
It was worth it.
And we had sex a lot today.
It was worth it. I got planned to sex, so I was payment for doing it.
And no bleeding this time. We got through that. We overcame.
Yeah.
So yeah.
But their triumph would be short-lived. Just 4 days after the murder, on April 13th, 2021, law enforcement located Sierra and Aaron in the hotel where they were hiding. The authorities moved quickly, surrounding the building and preparing for their arrest. The couple, unaware of how close the police were, had no idea their escape was about to end. When officers stormed the hotel room, they found the two lying on the bed, still dressed in the clothes they had worn during their escape. Bloodstains from the night of the murder were still visible. They offered little resistance as they were taken into custody, the weight of their crime finally catching up to them. Aaron remained quiet, while Sierra seemed dazed, as if she couldn't fully grasp the reality of what was happening. In the aftermath of their arrest, the details of Daniel Halseth's murder shocked the nation. The cold-blooded brutality of the attack, coupled with the youth of the killers, captivated public attention. How could a daughter so young, so seemingly ordinary, turn on her father with such violence? And what had driven these two teenagers to murder someone who had once loved and cared for them? The trial that followed was one of sorrow and disbelief. Investigators revealed the full scope of Sierra and Aaron's actions, from the planning of the murder to their failed attempt at fleeing the consequences. The video they had recorded in the hotel room, boasting about their crime, became a central piece of evidence, demonstrating their complete lack of remorse. In the months leading up to the trial, Sierra and Aaron were held in separate juvenile detention centers. The prosecution began building its case, charging them with first-degree murder, conspiracy, arson, and robbery. The defense, however, tried to paint a picture of two misguided teenagers, caught up in a whirlwind romance and driven to desperation by their circumstances. But no one could deny the facts. Daniel had been stabbed more than 70 times. His body had been mutilated, set on fire, and left to burn in his own home. The prosecution argued that this was not the act of frightened teenagers, but a calculated, premeditated murder fueled by hatred and rebellion. Sierra, once a bright and curious girl, sat stone-faced in the courtroom as the details of her father's death were recounted. Her mother, who had remained largely silent throughout the ordeal, attended the trial every day, her face etched with grief. She had lost her husband to murder, and now she was losing her daughter to the consequences of that crime. In the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense as Sierra Halseth and Aaron Guerrero faced the consequences of their brutal crime. The evidence against them was overwhelming. The surveillance footage, the gruesome details of Daniel Halseth's murder, and the chilling video they had recorded, laughing about getting away with murder. Aaron, unrepentant throughout the trial, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Sierra, who had shown some remorse and was just 16 at the time of the crime, received a life sentence, but with the possibility of parole after 22 years. The judge acknowledged her youth, but made it clear that the brutality of the murder could not be ignored. For Daniel's family, the sentences offered little solace. They had lost a beloved father, and Sierra's actions left them devastated. The courtroom's final words marked the end of the trial, but the pain of betrayal and the horror of Daniel's death would haunt them forever.